Hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is Krista Martel from the Well Project, and I'm really pleased to welcome everyone to our webinar today. As you know, we are going to be discussing race and why race matters, specifically around women, intersectionality, and HIV. And it's a very important topic, and we are really excited to have an amazing group of presenters here today, and my co-moderator, Olivia Ford. And we'll talk a little bit more about the webinar itself in the coming slides and some of the organizations that we're partnering with to present this webinar, including Positive Women's Network USA and the Body. And yes, just welcome, and we'll be getting started now. Just so everyone knows, the webinar is being recorded, and it will be available. We're going to make it available for 2 months following today's webinar. It will send out a link to everyone who's registered, to the page that will have the recording, the pre and post test, and available resources. And if you haven't already, we'll post the link in the chat box that has the pre-test, and we ask you to try and take that quickly if possible. You can use the chat box to enter any questions that you have, and we will also be opening up the lines at the end for Q&A so that we can actually have live voices for question and answers. So with that, I'm going to, again, introduce and hand it over to my co-moderator and Olivia Ford, who's been working with us on this topic and helping to develop the fact sheet and this webinar. So thank you, Olivia.
Absolutely. Krista, thank you so much for having me here and for bringing us all together. Again, as Krista mentioned, my name is Olivia Ford. Just a tiny bit about me. I have been working in HIV-related media and communications, and also in other sort of related health and justice issues since 2007. And I was honored to work with the Well Project on the fact sheet that kind of inspired this webinar, which was Why Race Matters, Women and HIV. And I'm going to introduce our phenomenal presenters in just a second, but before we begin, I hope everyone can hear me. Before we begin, I really just wanted to acknowledge, we all wanted to acknowledge and make space on this webinar, especially considering the topic that we're going to be discussing today. Just acknowledge with respect and with condolences and also with anger the unjustifiable murders. There were 3 murders by police in just the past couple of days of Black and brown men. One, Alton Sterling in Louisiana, my current home state, Philando Castle in Minnesota, that's news we just got recently, and also Anthony Nunez in San Jose, which is also news that I was just made aware of recently. And I just wanted to make space for those who may have heard that news and may not have, who may be holding it in their hearts, who may be having deep feelings around it. I just want to point out and remind us all that conversations about race and about addressing systems of oppression and ending racist practices, conversations about these do not end them in themselves. They do not make racism go away. They do not make racist policing go away. But they can be a first step for anyone who may feel a sense of hopelessness at these unjustifiable killings of people who are not doing anything, who are just living their lives. It can be a first step to start to talk about really honestly and really more importantly, listen to those who are most impacted by these issues. And that's something that we're going to be talking about here today. And I really, again, thank those who have come together and made it really the kind of part of their life's work to make sure that these conversations happen and that this lens is a part of our work. So without further ado, I'm just going to introduce kind of the agenda that we're going to be working with today. Thank you so much to everyone who is coming on. I see a lot of folks coming on from all over the country and the world. The first presenter that you'll hear from after we do some intros is Tonia Poteat from Johns Hopkins University. She'll be speaking on what does racism have to do with health disparities, how systems of oppression influence health outcomes. We also have Naina Khanna, the Executive Director of Positive Women's Network USA, speaking on everyday intersectionality, the impact of social identities on HIV care, services, and advocacy. And then we'll have J.D. Davids from thebody.com, speaking on unpacking privilege, understanding what it means, what can be done about it. And I believe we will have introductions of our fantastic co-presenting organizations now. So I'll pass it back to Krista.
Thank you, Olivia, and thank you for addressing the brutal murders that we've been witnessing far too often and waking up to. So I'm just going to give a very brief intro about the WELL Project. Again, my name is Krista Martel, and I'm the Executive Director of the WELL Project. We are a nonprofit organization with a mission to change the course of the HIV/AIDS pandemic through a unique and comprehensive focus on women and girls. So the WELL Project has been working to leverage technology to improve health outcomes and increase quality of life for women and girls living with HIV. And we've been doing that by focusing on providing accessible and comprehensive information through our library of regularly updated fact sheets, our community support programs that include our A Girl Like Me blog and Una Chica Como Yo, which is our blog in Spanish, as well as other social media groups and outlets, and our advocacy and capacity building, which we have been working to build upon in the past years, including our webinar series and the Watch webinar series. So hopefully everyone has already been there, but you can access the majority of our resources and join the community at thewellproject.org. So with that, I will hand it over to Naina to introduce and talk a little bit about PWN.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Good morning from the West Coast. I'm Naina Khanna, Executive Director of Positive Women's Network USA, and we are a national membership body of women living with HIV, inclusive of transgender women. We were founded in 2008 by 28 really diverse women living with HIV, and we continue to be led by women with HIV. We have about 3,000 members throughout the country, and we have 11 formally affiliated regional chapters. And our mission is to prepare and involve women living with HIV in all our diversity to be involved in policy and decision-making processes. And so in order to do that, we build and cultivate and support leadership, particularly in the communities most impacted by the epidemic, which are also the communities least likely to have access to decision-making spaces. So that's really our priority work. And our constituency are women of all gender experiences and gender identities, but we also very much work in allyship and alliance and solidarity with other communities impacted by the epidemic as well. Thanks so much to the WELL Project and thebody.com for the partnership on this webinar. We're glad to be here today.
Great, thank you, Naina. And next, JD will provide a little background on thebody.com, which hopefully most of you also know about. And both, as you know, the PWN and the Body are very valuable partners of the WELL Project. So on to you, JD.
Hi, thanks so much. Thebody.com is an online resource. It's been around for over 2 decades with information, resources, support, and dialogue about HIV. And we're very happy to be working with WELL Project and Positive Women's Network. We also love to have contributions from members of the HIV community sharing your stories and perspectives and your ideas also for what we should be doing on the site. So please contact us anytime.
Okay. Great. So just a quick about Watch. Watch is acronym for Women's Advocacy and Treatment Coalition on HIV, and what we have termed to be our advocacy series. This is our second year that we are producing this series, largely focusing on treatment advocacy, but also other very related issues to women and HIV, and hopefully kind of a building blocks of advocacy and capacity building to try and help more women be at the table, basically, as well as improve information and education. And what we found is that the information that's here or given at these webinars is also then disseminated further because many of the women and participants that attend these webinars have the tools now to go on and provide this information to others with the slides and the fact sheets that are provided. So this year we have done it a little bit differently. Instead of condensing it in an 8-week series, we are doing it over the course of the year. This is the third of the series, and we will be providing certificates of completion for those that participate in either the live or the recorded webinar, take the pre and post test for each one, as well as a final evaluation survey. And as it says here, this webinars are going to be available for 1 month, but for this particular one, we're going to be keeping it up for 2 months. Okay, and this is just a bit of housekeeping notes. The webinar will last about 90 minutes with Q&A at the end. As I said, we are going to be opening up the line, so when you if during the Q&A period, if you're interested in speaking, you can unmute yourself by pressing *6, and then we ask you to use your telephone mute button if you have unmuted yourself, just to keep background noise at a low. If you're using your microphone, the same thing, your computer microphone, just please mute it after you've asked the question so that we can keep the background noise down. And you are, as many of you know, you can use the live chat box to also put in questions during the webinars, and we will keep a tab of those and can pose those at the end for everyone. Okay, so I will hand it over to Olivia for our first poll question.
Apologies, I was on mute. Thank you so much, Krista. So this is where everyone who's currently on the webinar gets to engage. We'll have a few polls throughout the session. It would be great at this point to get a sense of what level of experience is on the call. And again, this is not, you're not being evaluated. This is not a test. It's just really interesting just to see folks' level of experience with conversations like this. So you'll see the poll question come up. There we go. And I'll read it out as well.
I'm going to just add real quick, Olivia, I'm sorry, before you go, just to let people know that all the poll questions are anonymous. So just in case, you're concerned, you can answer as honestly and freely as possible.
Thank you for that, Krista. So now, yes, what is your level of experience being part of conversations about race, gender, intersectionality, and/or, so any one of those, how these topics relate to HIV advocacy? So you've got a couple of options there. Folks can just take a minute to vote. Oh, excellent. That's a really wide range of experience, which is always exciting to have on webinars like this and on conversations like this.
Okay. Should I close it? Do you think it's time? You want to give it another?
Give me about 10 more seconds. Yeah, we'll give folks about 10 more seconds to vote.
Okay.
So cast your votes. Cast your final votes. And yeah. Oh wow. The spread is pretty even between folks who have some experience and those who are much more experienced with these kinds of conversations and folks who are fairly new to them. So thank you so much again for sharing your perspectives. I think now we can close the voting. Awesome. Thank you. Okay. So Thank you so much to everyone who voted. And now, and I can move the next slide. I am honored to pass the mic over to Dr. Poteat to share the first section of the first content section of the webinar.
Thank you, Olivia. Hello, everyone. I just want to preface with the fact that I am still sort of grieving and newly got this information when I woke up this morning. So know that that is happening. I currently work as an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, where I do research on HIV and human rights with a focus on gender, sexuality, and race. I've been involved in AIDS activism since the early 1990s and have been a medical provider, a physician assistant, providing care to people living with HIV since 1996. And I'm really pleased to have been a part of the WELL Project in some configuration or another for well over a decade. So I'm pleased to be with you today. And I want to start off with just an overview about why race matters and what we mean when we're talking about race. Often when you hear statistics about HIV, particularly in the United States, people talk about differences in rates of HIV by race. It's also important to know that HIV is one of many health conditions that affect people differently by race. Other common ones include diabetes and heart disease. And to understand that the cause of these differences are usually due to social factors rather than any genetic or biological basis. However, the root cause of why these differences exist is often misrepresented as being biologically based, and we'll talk just a little bit about why that is not the case. So when people talk about what race is, they usually talk about it as being related to physical traits. So the color of someone's skin, the shape of their eyes, the texture of their hair, or what region of the world they come from. But race is, I would say, not as much a social category, but more a social category than a biological one. There are not actually any genetic markers for race. So it's not like you could take people who've been categorized as different races, take a sample of their blood, go look in a lab, and find genetic differences that don't overlap. So there is no actual biological marker for race. And I think that's important to keep in mind as we listen to and think about the root causes of these differences by race that we hear about among all these different health conditions. What race does as a social category is a way of trying to explain differences in the way people live in society, how healthy they are, and how they're treated. So in reality, the social conditions that people live under are what affect their health, not how they look or what their genes are typically when we talk about race. However, race is a really powerful concept that's been used to separate people for a long period of time and make opportunities available to some people while keeping the same opportunities out of reach of other people. And one example of that in the United States is a long practice of what's called redlining, where banks and other people who provided loans for housing would draw literally red lines around areas where certain races were and were not allowed to purchase homes. And that kept a lot of people of color out of home ownership and prevented the building of wealth that happened in many families based on that home ownership. So that's just one example. And unfortunately, what we also see in medicine and science is that there continues to be a perpetuated misconception about what race is and how it operates to affect our health. One way that we can see how this isn't true is that racial categories vary by culture and geography as well as over time. For example, if we look at census categories in the United States, they have shifted over time in terms of what is and isn't considered race. One example is the term Hispanic, which was previously on the U.S. Census considered a race, and then more recently has been considered an ethnicity. And we see this if we compare the racial categories in the United States to racial categories in the in other countries. So, for example, I'd always thought of myself as a Black woman in the United States, and then I traveled to South Africa, and I was informed that I was not Black in South Africa. In South Africa, I was colored. So those categories shift over time and shift from place to place because they are socially constructed. And when we talk about health conditions in race, by race, we often refer to these as health disparities. But what do we mean when we say health disparities? Paul Farmer, who many of you may have heard of, is a global HIV activist, a physician, and a medical anthropologist. And he's called HIV-related health disparities the biological expression of social inequalities or unequal or unjust social conditions. So a health disparity is a difference in health that's linked to unequal or unjust social conditions. It could be a higher rate of disease among certain groups compared to others, even if there's ongoing prevention efforts. And depending on what those efforts are, if they depend on our access to certain resources in society that also differ by race, then those prevention efforts can actually perpetuate or expand differences by race. These differences don't just exist by race, however, they can exist according to gender, education, income level, ability, sexual orientation, region, and other categories. And social determinants of health, like poverty and lack of education, are linked to health disparities. So for women, racism, not race itself, is the social determinant of health. So with that background, I'd like to move on to talk a little bit about what are some of the differences that we see by race in HIV. I'm sorry, I have two screens open, so that's why you see me hesitating. So around the world, the face of HIV is overwhelmingly the face of a Black or brown woman. Worldwide, half of all the people living with HIV are women, and the vast majority of these women live in sub-Saharan Africa and in Asia, where the percentage of women with HIV living with HIV is rising. Furthermore, transgender women around the world are nearly 4 times more likely to be living with HIV than the general population. In the U.S., African American women and Latinas make up nearly 80% of women living with HIV, even though they're less than 30% of the U.S. female population. One study also showed that HIV rates are more than 3 times higher for Black transgender women than among white or Latina transgender women. So with that, I will close and let us move on to the next poll question.
Thank you so much, Tonia. Thank you for that that really important overview. So now folks will see that there's another poll up. Folks are already voting. That's great. This is definitely a charge that I hear often. I think that we often learn about from whether that's in school or from parents, from whatever sort of aspect of our upbringing, about not seeing a person's race or color. Interesting. So the voting is sort of coming out. And again, these polls are not to discern kind of a quote-unquote right or a quote-unquote wrong answer, but to see what people's experiences have been, and it's not an evaluation. But as we go into Naina's presentation, part of the presentation, we'll get to unpack this idea a little bit more. So I'll give people maybe about another 30 seconds to vote if there are others who would like to cast a vote in this poll who are able to. Well, it seems the voting has kind of slowed down a little bit, so maybe we'll give people about 10 seconds more. So last opportunities to vote. All right. Yeah, and someone made a point about sort of the specificity of the poll question in the chat box. And the questions are also sort of deliberately very broad and open so that people are able to sort of interpret them based on their kind of general experience. But thank you so much for voting. And with that, I'm going to pass the mic to Naina Khanna. Naina?
Thanks, Olivia. Yeah, can you hear me?
Absolutely. Great.
Okay, great. Thanks, Thanks, Olivia, and thanks, Tonia and Krista, for a great start to this webinar. I have to say I'm also in a similar place to Tonia, having just found out about, a couple of the recent murders this morning, a couple of hours ago, but glad to be here with all of you discussing this important topic. And so what I'm going to be talking about is thinking through what's called intersectionality, which is basically sort of thinking about how different aspects of our social location and our identities structure access to services, to HIV care, and really ultimately affect health. And so just starting off a little bit with talking about racism, again, I think Tonia said a lot of this really well. I think what's important to understand is that, racism is a system, and a lot of people have really, sort of different understandings about what race is. There are, especially in sort of like health and science literature, there are a number of like searches for, genetic markers for particular things. A lot of studies are done that kind of like hold white as like the normative category and study everybody else kind of in relation to that, failing to kind of to problematize that, we really can't mark race as like a genetic, it's not genetically marked. It's not like something that you can necessarily find in somebody's DNA. It's very much socially constructed. It's very much politically constructed, and it's changed over time. And race has always been used to do very specific ideological and political work. So Omi and Winant are a couple of authors who write really well about how the American economy and our system of capitalism here in the U.S. was really built on and predicated on and dependent on racism. It required believing that people who were Black, people who were Native American, were somehow inferior so that we could actually justify genocide, exploiting labor, treating people like they were not human. Many practices which continue to this day. And so understanding that racism is very much part of American history is important to thinking about how folks are impacted today. Because a lot of those systems and structures have not gone away, they've just taken new forms. And so what Tonia was talking about with like redlining practices, what we see in terms of police brutality and killings, are not that different. Then they're just kind of new forms, more subtle forms of racism. And so racism is not so much about what one person does to another person, although that can be a part of racism. But racism is really about a system in which people are differently valued based on how their race is socially constructed. And so we see, for example, in a lot of these cases of police brutality and police killings, like the Michael Brown case, where we had the cop Darren Wilson testifying and saying, this guy was huge, he was coming at me, he looked like a demon, he was savage. Trayvon Martin, a 17-year-old kid who was, thought to be a thug. Like these sort of like stereotypes are part of the narratives around race that get constructed that really have a huge impact on people's health. And they provide, advantage to some individuals and some communities. So some individuals and communities get privileged as a result of these narratives, and some get really hurt. And overall, racism isn't good for anybody. It's not good for any of us. And so race also has a lot to do with how and why some communities are more likely to acquire HIV and to have worse health outcomes. And so, but it's not about, it's not necessarily about some sort of biological susceptibility. What we're talking about is social and structural vulnerability. So a system that, that sort of like structurally puts you at disadvantages for having access to health care, for being able to pay for your care, for being treated well when you walk into a doctor's office, for being, if there are stereotypes about people of your race, that you tend to be more adherent to medication or less adherent to medication, that you do what a doctor says or don't do what a doctor says, those can all really impact your health care. So we also see racism play out a lot in the ways that media narratives are constructed around a number of things. And so this slide is showing, just how the percentage of African American suspects in TV crimes on the left bar here, the left graph here, versus the actual data. And so we see that the blue bars here are the percentages of suspects arrested who were African American, as opposed to the percentage of African American suspects who were in media reports. And so this is a study of media analysis. And so you can see that that Black folks of African descent, are being very much overrepresented in crime reports by television. And so, this is all part of what creates a narrative around, who is likely to be, quote, deviant in society, needs to be policed, needs to be controlled, is a threat, and needs to be contained. And that's very much a narrative that we also see playing out with people with HIV. We also see here on the right-hand side, you can see this image, and I don't think this will be a surprise probably to a lot of people on this call, for African-American men who were arrested in a burglary investigation, who are all being shown in their mugshots, 3 young white men who are wrestlers who are also arrested for burglary, who are all being shown in their suits and ties, presumably their school photos or something like that. So these types of representations in media, continue to sort of penetrate our society. And this is all part of what being in a racist system is about. So a system, again, that is systematically privileging certain people, even in the way that the same quote crime is being portrayed here, right? Different people are being shown differently based on race. So what are some of the effects of racism? Well, racism causes stress. It is deeply traumatizing to experience racism, and there have been quite a few studies also looking at the role of historical trauma and racism over generations. So trauma that certain communities have been disproportionately impacted by over generations, that can actually structure life and health outcomes today. But also living every day, and I think many folks are kind of familiar with thinking about how trauma can impact health. Well, if you think about racism, homophobia, gender discrimination, these forms of aggression that people experience every day as actually traumas and wounds that get inflicted on people, we can understand how they can actually have an impact on physical health as well as emotional, spiritual well-being. And so also racism is not just about individual behavior. You can be white or a person of a particular race and have friends of many different races. You can never have meant to harm anyone because of their race, but can still benefit from a racist system. And so a racist system being one that places a higher value on the lives of white people than people of color. And I would say, as a South Asian woman, I would say that places higher value generally on people who are non-Black. So my community, the South Asian community, has benefited from anti-Black racism as well, and from white supremacy as well. And so there are, race is complicated, and there are ways in which we are all structured and shaped and marked by race. And so I think it's really important to be sort of nuanced about these conversations. because there are many communities that benefit from racism. It's not only white people. So what does it mean to be anti-racist? Well, I think the first thing is being anti-racist is not just about ignoring race. The idea of being colorblind, not seeing color, doing away with programs like affirmative action, or thinking that, we just need to be sort of like, quote, race neutral, that's actually very much in line with sort of neoliberal ideologies that assume that everybody is starting at the same place. We can all just pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and fight for an equal place at the table. But we know that that's not true. I mean, I think, anybody who's paying attention, and probably all of you who care enough to be on this webinar, know that that's very much not true. People are not starting from the same place here. Folks are starting with different amounts of structural advantages and disadvantages. And so being anti-racist means actually working actively to counter those structural disadvantages and dismantle those. So taking action to dismantle those, not just ignoring them and pretending them they're going to go away. So it's like, if you imagine being at a race and somebody's starting like 20 feet behind, are you just going to pretend that 20 feet is not there and say, well, we're all on equal footing here because the ground is level? No, that's not the answer. What are you going to do to make up that gap? So being anti-racist is an active commitment. I think it's also something that requires ongoing work, right? So race is a topic that many of us may not be that comfortable talking about. We may not have a lot of experience talking about. We may not know exactly how to talk about it, and we may not know how to talk about it without like hurting or offending other people. And so I'm going to talk a little bit later about some of the work we can do, work we can do around that. And I know one of our final speakers is going to lead us to sort of some resources around that. But being anti-racist does mean, acknowledging when we see racial bias show up, and being honest about and recognizing the ways that we might benefit from systems that are biased against other people. So, for example, being a person who's comfortable taking up space in a meeting, when somebody else might not be as comfortable taking up that space, or might be perceived if they take the mic and are upset about something happening, might just be perceived as like angry and not taken seriously. So understanding how race can play a role in all of these different micro interactions, as well as the sort of macro level. So I just want to think a little bit about intersectionality beyond race, because race doesn't just exist alone, right? So there's we have a race experience, but we also have a race experience that kind of tracks with gender, it tracks with class, it tracks with our education privilege, it tracks with our immigration status. So all of these things sort of intersect together. And intersectionality is a framework that thinks about how our experiences and our opportunities are structured by many different systems and accesses of both privilege and oppression. So we can simultaneously be oppressed and privileged at the same time. As a South Asian woman living with HIV, I can experience discrimination and stigma on the basis of my HIV status. I can also be privileged because of my education level. I can be privileged. I can experience both, racial oppression and racial privilege simultaneously, right? As somebody who's non-white and somebody who's not Black. And so all of these things are very complicated. And so thinking about how our experiences are and the opportunities that are available to us are differently structured is really important in terms of thinking about what's really needed. I also happen to be, even though I'm a woman living with HIV, I don't have a visible disability. right? So that is also a form of privilege. So these are just some of the things for us to think about. And all of these identities, experiences, and systematic sort of like places where we're socially situated, right, which might not have, our experiences or identities don't always line up with how we're socially situated. The way we see ourselves is not always the way that others see us or place us, and that can change from context to context, right? So all of these things are socially structured and impact our lives simultaneously. I see some really good chatter going on in the chat box here, and I'm looking forward to our discussion later because I think it's going to be vibrant. So intersectionality is really about understanding that we can't separate out parts of a person's identity. You know, Black folks are not monolithic. South Asian folks are not monolithic. People who are white are not monolithic. There are lots of different types of experiences and needs that go sort of like within each of those buckets. So, you know, for example, intersectional frameworks really came very much out of Black feminist frameworks, from Black feminist thinkers and leaders who said the civil rights struggle is critically important, but there are ways in which it is not really addressing gender dynamics and gender oppression. And women are not being treated as equal, and some of these gender dynamics are actually playing out in the civil rights struggle. And similarly, feminism, at the time they were writing, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, feminism and the feminist movement at that time was very much constructed as a white feminist movement. And a lot of the leaders in the feminist movement were not willing to acknowledge that race was also impacting women who were identifying as feminists. And so, Black feminists came together and started to, you know, write a series of sort of framing pieces around and framing this idea of intersectionality that considers race and considers class and considers gender and sexual orientation and, you know, different aspects of social location. So I think I'm turning it over to Olivia to lead us through this poll question.
Sure, just for a minute. Thank you so much, Naina. There is, like you said, there's awesome conversation going on in the chat box, and you're just really providing a fantastic framework for this conversation. So yeah, we're also curious to see how this concept of intersectionality lands with folks on the call. I know that there are many who are familiar with the concept, and there are others for whom it may be new, or it may be not new but confusing. So I'm curious, do you relate to this idea of how different parts of our identities impact our lives at the same time? Does it make sense? Just take some time to vote. I see a lot of votes coming in. It's a good time to have this question because Naina just gave a really concise, really just beautiful, unpacked definition of the concept and made it really accessible. So for those who might have answered differently just about 5 minutes ago, we definitely are in a more on the same page in terms of the concept. I'll give folks another 10 seconds to vote if anybody else wants to cast a vote. All right, and with that, we can close voting on that poll. Thank you so much. Naina, if you want to pick up the mic again.
Sure. And so this is just a quote by, I think, one of the Girl Like Me bloggers who may be on this webinar with us today, and I maybe can expand on it a little bit more. And so Aria says, I live in the basement, the lowest floor of the social systems we have here in America. Proud and jubilant footsteps drum upon my ceiling from the house parties of the heterosexual, the men, those not of color, and even the LGB crowd. I first learned about the perceived differences in skin color, notwithstanding our commonality or upbringing. As someone who was always feminine, I quickly then learned the demeaning micro and outright violent aggressions against women or femininity in our male-dominated society. When I first started transitioning in the year of 1998 and entered my life as a transgender person, the basement door became sealed. And I encourage folks to look at Aria's blog, and hopefully Aria can delve in a little bit during the discussion and share a little bit more about this. But, this idea that the basement, really kind of thinking about intersectionality. One of the activities that we do sometimes at PWN gatherings is an activity where people sort of get to place their bodies in a room according to different ways that they've been impacted by discrimination, oppression, privilege. And it really helps us to see visually and to think about how to center the voices, leadership, and participation of those who are being most disproportionately impacted in a meaningful way. And I think Aria's blog here really captures that beautifully. And so what can we do about this? And I'm going to wrap up kind of quickly here so that we can transition to our next fabulous speaker. So, number one, just as I was saying, put those who are most impacted by an issue front and center. That is the best way for us to be allies on race and on any other issue. If those who are not impacted by an issue are not at the table or are not there in a meaningful way, then it's our job to get them there if we have a way to do that. And so, and also, I think that kind of leads to when those who are being impacted by an issue speak about it, it's our job to listen as allies and to learn and to challenge ourselves, especially when we get defensive around things that, I didn't mean for it to come across that way. Well, maybe it's not about me. Maybe I just need to be quiet and listen to what my trans sister is telling me she's experiencing, or what my Black sister is telling me she's experiencing and how it landed with her. There's a difference between intent and impact, right? And they're both important. Practice active allyship. So understanding that ally is not just something we get to claim as a noun. I don't just get to say, I'm an ally to X community. No, that community gets to tell me if I'm being a good ally or not. Being a good ally means that I commit to ongoing learning, ongoing dialogue. We also have to challenge ourselves. So taking initiative to learn about ways other communities experience oppression. And that, by the way, does not mean going to somebody and saying, tell me about how your life has been impacted by racism, or tell me how it feels to be Black, and be like looking at these videos of extreme police brutality and violence, or, and so we can't, it's not for communities who are oppressed to educate other communities about their oppression. There are plenty of resources that we can go to learn about understanding and unpacking our own privilege, understanding and unpacking oppression, and being better allies. And we can also connect with advocacy groups that are fighting at the intersections of other issues. So sometimes, in the HIV community, a lot of us, I think, are pretty clear that HIV never sort of exists on its own. Very few of us experience HIV as just a one-dimensional issue. It is so, in the U.S. context, it very much intersects with issues around race and transphobia and homophobia and poverty. And so we can't just fight one battle at a time. It's important for us to stand with other groups as well, and not just because we want them to take on our issue, but because it's the right thing to do. And then also we can recognize our own privilege and use it for change. So privilege is not something to be ashamed of. It can be uncomfortable. I think it's important to acknowledge that. It can be uncomfortable, but we have a responsibility with whatever privilege we have, whether it's, even just the privilege to be on this webinar today is a certain amount of privilege, right, to have access to the technology that lets us be on a webinar like this. So how do we get to use that for change and think about the kinds of social, political, economic structures we can change. And I will just leave you with this quote from a couple of our fabulous leaders at Positive Women's Network USA, Vanessa Johnson and Wahida Shabazz-El, who wrote a piece earlier this year for National Black HIV/AIDS Awareness Day, connecting this back to HIV. The HIV epidemic in this country will end when America commits to addressing the underlying conditions which enable HIV to thrive, such as racism and poverty, right? So this is not just about treating our way out of an epidemic. This is about understanding that HIV is not, never has been, never will be just a disease. It is always a symptom of human rights violations and social injustice. And it's those fundamental conditions that it is our responsibility to change. So I'll turn it back over to Olivia.
Again, thank you so much, Naina, for just really, really outlining so many of these issues and unpacking them so beautifully. I'm going to take us quickly through this poll. That should, it's a true and false, so it should be a pretty quick one for folks to vote in. And there it goes. So this is, and again, these are all anonymous. So the poll question goes back to something that Naina was saying a few minutes ago, that folks can often be uncomfortable with the idea that they have privilege, uncomfortable talking about privilege, and just curious to see graphically with the poll results where we as a group land on that question. So I'll give people again, this is a straightforward one, give folks about 10 more seconds to vote. In this poll, before we move on. And again, thank you everyone for being so present and just really open to this conversation and participating in the chat box as well and with the polls. And with that, the poll is closed. Thank you so much. And I'm going to pass the mic to JD Davids.
Hi, am I unmuted now?
Oh, you are unmuted.
Hi.
JD, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks Olivia, and thanks to everyone for being part of this important discussion. And I feel really honored to be here. Just a little background on me. I come here as someone from a upper middle class background, as a white transmasculine person who's not living with HIV, who's living with chronic illness and some invisible disabilities, and a long history of gratitude for being in the HIV movement for about 20-something years through ACT UP Philadelphia and other activities now at thebody.com. So I feel like some of what is in these slides has already been so beautifully covered by Naina and Tonia and others, and then the discussion on the webinar interface. So I'm going to go through things fairly quickly so we can get to the big discussion. What is privilege? As discussed, it's a set of unearned, often invisible benefits experienced by people who, based on aspects of their identity, or I would add, of their perceived identity, fit into social groups that have power. White race, middle or upper class, male, cisgender, heterosexual, documented U.S. citizen, HIV negative, etc. And often, as we see in this presentation discussion and throughout, I certainly remember moments in my life where I was made aware of my own privilege, things I took for granted because I only have lived one life, right? So examples including most people you or your children study in classes and books will share your race, gender, or sexual orientation. Your errors will not be thought as being due to your race or gender. You don't have to think about race, class, gender, sexual orientation, disabilities on a daily basis. And very acutely right now in the United States, this has always been going on, but there's been more attention to the fact of, particularly, for people who are white and middle class or up, not feeling on a regular basis that our family members are at risk of police murder or extreme violence from the state. This is a quote from a really powerful A Girl Like Me blog from Mel, who's with us today. I'm a white woman, I have privilege, I recognize we don't have a hashtag for white lives. Some would say that I experienced racism as a Mzungu, a white person living in rural Kenya. I was not treated the same. My hair was touched with fascination, kids would point and follow me, but this is not racism. I was not regarded as inferior, unworthy, or as a lesser person. Mostly I was considered as another human being who looked different. And she writes about having brought this up because she's seen discussion of something called people are calling racism towards white people, and that pains her. And it certainly pains me. Racism is a systemic act that's carried out by individuals as well as organizations and governments. And to me, racism is something that is inextricable from white privilege and privilege. And so there can be bias, and there could be, different things that happen across people of different races, but racism, when it's fueled by the often invisible but very real systems behind it, tends to be particularly anti-black racism and racism against people of color. It's often easier to notice the expression you experience than the privilege, because being mistreated leaves a deeper impression than fair treatment. It's not to say that I, as a white person, have not experienced oppression as a queer person or as someone who was brought up in an abusive situation, but it wasn't due to my race. It wasn't due to these. It doesn't take away other privileges I have. It doesn't mean that you don't work hard or have trauma. It's not special advantages. It's basic fair. Well, privilege is special advantages. The problem is it's not basic fairness. It's not that a privileged person gets more than they deserve, but that others don't have privilege get less than they deserve. It's tricky in an environment of capitalism, which is so much based on people. Some people have almost an inherent right to more because of privilege. It's really enshrined as something. It's valuable or honored or seen as important that some do better than others. So it's sort of like we're fish swimming in this water. It can be pretty hard to imagine what it'd be like to be swimming in an ocean of justice and what that would look like. But how is it that we can live today just one or two more steps into modeling the world we want to live in, to be swimming in that ocean of justice when we're in an ocean of such injustice all the time? And that's where it does become clear that this is an active struggle. This is something we actively and intentionally need to approach, because it's not something that's in our overall environment. Privileges and oppressions don't cancel each other out. So, for example, poor or working class white people can be oppressed by poverty and still benefit from being white. And also the leadership classes, the most privileged classes in the United States, who are mostly wealthy people of color, have benefited for centuries of pitting poor and working class white people against people of color, to have poor working class people be sort of the front lines of being encouraged to blame and shame others for displacing what their sense of injustice against economic injustice and marginalization. There's a really classic piece, this is the Denver Principles, people may be familiar with in our HIV movement, was written in 1982 by people living with AIDS who invented the term in that document. People living with AIDS is like this real foundational document. There's a foundational document on white privilege, I believe it's from 1989, called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, that talks about it's by an academic person who talks about becoming conscious of white privilege and talking about it as an invisible, weightless knapsack of special provisions, passports, maps, etc. And in that, she lists 26 skin color privilege conditions, and that's a link up there if you want to go check it out. And it's about how white people are taught to identify racism as putting each other at disadvantage. However, we're not taught about how white privileges put us at an advantage. And that reminds me of how we, in our own movement, we know that HIV stigma puts people with HIV at a disadvantage, but one of the things that makes it so hard to dismantle is the invisibility that others who are not living with HIV advantage. There's benefits to people, often very symbolic or intangible, but there's benefits to people perpetuating HIV stigma as far as saying, I am safe, I'm okay, I don't need to think about my sexual activities. I don't need to think about drug use. I just live life and I'm not at risk. There's these other people over there. They're the ones who are both at risk and at blame. So HIV stigma is sort of a microcosm of this dynamic where we can see how it hurts people, but to really tackle these things, we need to say who is benefiting. Sometimes people are benefiting in really concrete ways, like more access to wealth. Sometimes it's more subtle, such as freedom from microaggressions that create trauma that actually ends lives and create illness and end lives. I wanted to share just for myself, I thought about what was my knapsack, particularly as an adolescent who in some ways was at high risk of HIV behaviorally. As an adolescent who experienced abuse and trauma and had several years of high rates of condomless receptive sex with cisgender men and drug and alcohol use, here's some of the things that were in my knapsack that I think had health protective effects as far as it turns out I didn't become HIV positive. There were low community rates of HIV in the mostly white, suburban, middle to upper class community that I lived in the northeastern U.S. And that's not just an accident. It's HIV, if you look at the maps in New York City of where HIV sort of started and predominated, it has to do where there was withdrawal of economic resources. And, for example, in the Bronx, where literally blocks were allowed to burn down in order for people to be able to make a profit in rebuilding. There were low background STI rates that could have increased my risk of HIV infection. There's research showing that if you look at adolescents and STI rates, if you look across behaviors, if you look at white adolescents, there's youth are more likely to have STIs if they have other behaviors that are sort of correlated with marginalization or sort of having some struggles. With African American adolescents in the study, they actually had higher rates of STIs, even if they're sort of doing better in other ways or weren't, doing drugs or smoking or other sort of indicators that could be being in harm's way because of background prevalence and because of the kinds of health disparities that we talk about. In my community, stimulant and opiate use, both which I engaged in, was not primarily injection-based, so I wasn't using needles. I was in a community that had been flooded with heroin in the 60s and 70s, and then the sort of fallout of that. My community wasn't under the scrutiny of law enforcement, so there was open drug use and sales, including I participated in drug sales at low arrest or sanctions. So I didn't get caught up in a system of having a record that can affect employment, affect opportunities, affect health outcomes. And as someone who did not yet recognize myself as LGBT and was gender normative at the time, I didn't experience additional trauma or violence related to being queer. So when we think about, we now pivot to, okay, what are we going to do to challenge injustice, to challenge white supremacy and challenge and fight for racial justice? I say to my fellow white people, there's a useful article by a great group called SONG, Southerners on New Ground, the role of white people in the movement at this time, that I recommend checking out at that link. And it opens with this quote from Ricardo Levins Morales, and he says, white people are taught that racism is a personal attribute, an attitude, maybe a set of habits. Anti-racist whites invest too much energy worrying about getting it right, about not slipping up and revealing their racial socialization, about saying the right things and knowing when to say nothing. It's not about that. It's about putting your shoulder to the wheel of history, about undermining the structural supports of a system of control that grinds us under, that keeps us divided even against ourselves, and that extracts wealth, power, and life from our communities like an oil company sucks it from the earth. The names of the Euro-descended anti-racist warriors we remember, John Brown, Ann Braden, Miles Horton, are not those of the people who did it right. They are the people who never gave up. They kept their eyes on the prize, not on their anti-racism grade point average. This will also be the measure of your work. Be there. There are things in life we don't get to do right, but we do get to do them. So here's some ideas of how to stepping up, not on, in our efforts for those of us who are white people. And also I'm a white Jewish person involved in anti-oppression and racial justice struggles. Show you're here for the long haul and don't expect others to jump right in. I feel like for me, it was very important for me to be able to be rooted in one community for 20 years as a young adult, working with the same communities over and over and learning that people have both the right and the wisdom to sit back and observe and say, who is this person, before saying, yeah, I'm going to get involved with these sort of things you're doing, or I'd like to collaborate with you, or I'm going to invite you in. My general first rule of being an advocate is extra important here. Do what you say you will do, or tell someone if you find you are not able to. Being authentic and present in collaboration is always important. And it's even more important when we're working across lines of race, class, gender, sexuality. Just being authentically able to say, here's what I think I could do. Oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't. And not just walking away out of shame or embarrassment, or saying, here's what I learned by not being able to come through. Making amends, when it's not that, and that quote I just read, it's not about not trying. It's about doing our best effort, and then if we make a mistake or learn from an opportunity to do things differently next time, that we live that amends to do things differently next time and be open to apologizing or asking for input without expecting others to have to set something down to do that, or expecting to be validated by being, forgiven, or just hanging in there and trying to act with some grace. I feel like I don't know what would have happened if I was on social media 20 years ago. It's pretty vicious out there, and it may not be worthwhile or even detrimental to try to engage in online arguments about issues of oppression or justice if we're not rooted in day-to-day collaboration and day-to-day efforts with people we know in real life. I think it can be really damaging to people being able to hang in there, so it's up to you. There's no obligation. I sometimes put stuff on Facebook that people start discussing, and I take it down because I realize, you know what? This is just people heating things up, and I don't think it's going to change anything, and I'm just going to take this down. Having an accountability buddy is one of the many suggestions in that song document about the role of white people in the movement at this time. An accountability buddy, for me, it's another person who's white, who's engaged in racial justice struggles, with whom I have a confidential sharing where I can ask for input or help or reflection, so and vice versa, where we can check in with each other and do it on our own time, and be able to support each other as we learn and grow. And lastly, I think there's plenty of opportunities. It's really crucial to be a force of racial justice outside HIV as well as in our movements. By being people from the HIV community in broader movements, we not only are a force of sort of combating HIV stigma and doing HIV education, we are living the reality of, as was talked about in the chat room before we even sort of jumped into the call today, that the factors that exacerbate HIV and underpin the disparities in this country and around the world are oppression, capitalism, lack of racial justice, gender bias. Working on solid campaigns in these areas and building up relationships is a great way for us to both change the conditions that affect HIV and to let more people know about what also specifically is important to us in the HIV community, in which we will ask for support. And today's a sadly important time around the country as people are gathering to once again speak out against the state and police murder of people of color, which is happening constantly and then sometimes gets in the media in this way. It's an opportunity for us to go, to bring our neighbors, to bring our children, to bring ourselves, and to speak out with other people with HIV, people in the HIV community, about why we feel it's important. For those of us who are white identified, there's a group called showingupforracialjustice.org, or SURJ, which is a national network of people, white people organizing for racial justice. I really recommend getting involved. It was started by people I've worked with for many years, and is sort of holding this space for what we need to do to be accountable in being a force in the struggle. So that's all I have in slides, and now there's a poll question. And thanks again for the opportunity to share those ideas and to work alongside so many of you for many years and into the future.
JD, thank you so much. This is Olivia again. Thank you so much again for being here and for bringing your extensive just knowledge and expertise around these issues. Taking folks through the final poll just to see where people's perspectives lie and where you land in terms of bringing this kind of racial justice lens to your own advocacy work. So the poll is up. I'll read it out as well. Which of these statements best matches your thoughts about race and advocacy at this point? So just choose the answer that most matches your experience. And of course, then for those who are in need of more resources, this webinar is a resource. There are additional resources listed at the end as well, so that we will have time for kind of more open conversation and questions either from the chat box or from folks' own voices. We'll close the poll in probably about 20 seconds, so please definitely take or give people 30 seconds to finish voting. I know it's a few more to read, kind of longer to read than the other ones have been, but thank you all so much for voting, for sharing your experiences, and for being present and for listening in these conversations, and the commitment that it takes to do that, and for future commitments that you make to bringing this kind of anti-oppression lens into your work. So at this point, as kind of to lead us into the Q&A portion of the presentation, I really want to open up the floor to two Girl Like Me bloggers who we presentation, Aria Lester, I hope that I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Aria, and Mel Ratu. So I'll ask Aria to speak a little bit first, really about what I really want.
All attendees are muted and may unmute themselves by pressing *6.
Excellent. So now we have the opportunity when folks want to hit *6 and unmute yourself. So Aria can do that, Mel can do that. I want to ask Aria first, and then Mel, and then also we have on the call, I believe, still Rebecca Dennison, who's an amazing longtime activist, founder of World, and dear friend, I believe, of all of us on this call as well, who with whom I've spoken to a lot on this issue, who has some really, really things to say as well. So I'm going to ask Aria, Mel, and then Rebecca to just say a few words. Aria, are you here? I see the two people.
Yes,
if you are, then you're.
Yes,
oh, hi.
Here.
Hello.
Is here.
Araya. Sorry, I missed
Yes.
that.
That's fine.
I'm sorry, I mispronounced your name. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for writing this powerful blog entry that really inspired part of the writing of this, the fact sheet, and then eventually the webinar that came out of it that we're having today. And I wondered if you could just share for a minute what was kind of one takeaway message you hoped that readers, community members would get from your writing of that piece.
Oh, it's like you said earlier, and a few other presenters mentioned, it's one thing to read about the statistics of communities and populations that are more highly affected by things like HIV, as well as cofactors such as poverty and homelessness and unemployment and violence. But it's different when you put a personal story onto it. So when I wrote my blog, I wanted to give my personal story, something other than, I got, raped and got infected with HIV, and I'm a Black transgender woman of color, to kind of put it in perspective as far as from my internal view, coming as a child and being brought up, and when you have that realization of race, it's not something that we are born knowing. It's something that we gradually come to realize according to where we're at on the lines of race, that line of privilege, if you're above or you're below. And in early ages, that was the first thing that I started to notice about the difference of me and other people that were above that privilege line. And then, after that, being a trans woman and starting to realize that, and being a woman and how femininity is treated in a male-dominated society. So I just kind of wanted to put all of that together in a short little story to just try to put a little education through storytelling.
Thank you so much, Araya. Thank you again for being here to share that experience. And for I really encourage folks who are on the call here to read the full blog entry, both of Araya's and of Mel's as well. They're online. They're on thewellproject.org. on the A Girl Like Me blog, just a real, as you said, powerful illustration of your experience, and you're not alone in it, certainly. It's really part of a number of overlapping systems of oppression, really. Thank you so much, Araya. Mel, are you here on the call as well? Thank
Hello.
you.
Hello.
Hi, Mel. Hi, Mel. Hello. Thank you so much for being here as well. And I just wanted to ask you to speak for a bit on the same question. Really, what did you hope that readers and what did you hope that community members would come away with when you wrote the piece, Black Lives Matter, from the perspective of a white woman?
Well, I wrote it, as I do for a lot of the blogs, really to release. It's for my own catharsism. So I have to hold my hand up that really when I wrote that, that was just me ranting. It wasn't really necessarily as an impact. It was a release of anger. And that's what I love about the Well Women's Project, is that anything that you write is accepted and taken. And then actually you find that it does have an impact. So I was just angered at the time with all that was going on about white racism, and it just shocked me. So I wanted to have a voice, and it's not something that people in my own area really understand, but you know, to see it within HIV advocacy and just in I just wanted to write something. So it's interesting that it was picked and had an impact. But what I'd like to say about what I understand about my white privilege is that one of the reasons why I am more empathic, or maybe have more of an understanding, or more open to it, because even just with the first comment of there's been 3 murders, you know, maybe some people would have just turned that off, or not even wanted to sit with that sense of being uncomfortable. Or the first thing you said was to hold that in our heart. And, you know, I hold that in my heart. And one of the reasons is because I have children of color, you know, and that it affects me. And so many white people don't have that connection, don't have that sense of love, don't have that ability to actually feel it, to feel that, you know, people are dying. And another thing that I want to say is that, you know, we are waking up to it. There is a consciousness. This has been going on for years, for generations, and we are now waking up to it. And that's the thing of the beauty. The fact that we are having this conversation now is amazing, because, you know, people of color have been murdered, have been brutalized for years and years and years and years, but now we're waking up to it, we're understanding it. I knew about Ferguson because of my children and social media, and I understand that, you know, people, do you know what, I just realized now, I just want to shut up now, because this is what happens when you give a white woman a microphone. She just wants to talk. And really what the most important lesson is here is just that I need to shut up and let other people have a voice, because that's the key. I see it on my screen here. Listening is key. So I'm just going to shut up now.
Well, Mel, thank you so much for listening, and really thank you so much for speaking as well. No, really, thank you so much. I think that it's even just what you said now is a really important example of, you know, that taking those steps of not only recognizing privilege but also acting on what you hear and what you recognize. So yeah, thank you for raising your voice and also for modeling listening. Really appreciate you, and I really appreciate you around for being here. We have about 10 minutes. I want to still give Rebecca Dennison the mic. Rebecca, are you here? Do you have? Are you able to speak for a couple of minutes? It'd be wonderful to hear some of your perspective as well. If you're still on the call, if you can hit *6, so we can hear your voice, if you would like. Yes, so you can hit *6 on your phone, and we should be able to hear you. Oh, trying. Okay. Again, really honored to have everyone on the call. And, if you're on the computer with your mic, then you need to unmute your speakers, I believe. It's not *6 on the... There you go. Is that you?
Oh, that's Krista. Let's see if I can do it from the kind of back end side if she's having trouble here. Click to mute. I'm going to try this. She might... Okay, Rebecca, try unmuting. Okay, you might be unmuted now. No. Oops. Let's see. Well, maybe, no, she said she hit the mic and it's swirling. Uh-oh. I think she might have disconnected. Maybe, do we want to move on and then we'll come back to Rebecca if we can get her? Oh, wait, I see her on. Oh, okay.
You know what? Rebecca's asking, should I try calling in? If you've got the call-in number, that would be excellent. And I do think that perhaps what we can do, if this works, is start the Q&A. So if folks have questions, if they that they want to ask presenters, you can hit *6 to unmute yourself, or you can ask a question in the chat box. And then, Rebecca, yes, it would be really still amazing to hear from you if you're able to call in and then speak as part of the Q&A. If that works. So if anyone, you now have the power, you're empowered to unmute yourself. I'll thank you so much for sharing the dial-in number, Krista. And so you can now, everyone can hit *6, unmute yourselves. You don't all have to. And again, let's stay on mute when we're not speaking. But please feel free to share any questions that you've got for these fantastic, amazing presenters. You know, there have been a lot of comments in the chat box, and I'll leave it. I will stop talking and put down the mic so that others can as well. And if anyone's speaking right now, they're on mute, hearing quiet. Let's see, were there any questions in the chat box to potentially address? There were some really phenomenal comments. I just heard someone, was someone just trying to come off mute? Please speak, feel free.
Your line is now unmuted.
You know, hi, this is JD, and I realized there's one thing I think I erased or didn't get in my slides, which is about sort of those of us who have the privilege of access to be in discussions or the importance of bringing others with us and also not setting people up. So it's been important for me through the years to not be like, oh, I'm going to get one person onto this panel or onto this board or committee, to have multiple people so no one is isolated. People get sort of plucked out and isolated is a tactic that actually takes power from people and can sort of remove us or them from their sort of community accountability. So bringing people along or bringing people instead of us also means making room for multiple people, not just one person who can get isolated.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for I think that was a bullet on the slide, but thank you for pointing it out specifically, JD, really important point. So now, was there a,
Rebecca,
I believe that Rebecca is available. Hello? Hello?
Yeah, Rebecca, did you hit *6? Okay.
You're still quiet.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Okay, great.
Oh my gosh. Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
Oh, okay. I'm so sorry. So am I live? Like everybody can hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you for being here.
Okay. So hi, I'm so glad you're having this. I actually signed up to be a learner on this webinar. So I didn't really think about it when Olivia asked me if I would share a couple words, and I had something kind of long, but I want to keep my comments short if I can. I've been living with HIV for 33 years. When I started World, I had almost no experience with people of color at all. I don't think I ever had an African-American person in any of my classes, kindergarten through 12th grade. And I think when I started out, like, I had really good intentions, and I knew I didn't want to be racist. But a mistake that I made was that when things came up, I was very focused on wanting to make sure somebody knew that I was a good person and that I wasn't racist. And it took me a while to learn to just stop worrying about that. You were raised to be racist. You're going to say racist things, and to just try and stop and listen and learn and be open and not be defensive. Are you still there? I'm hearing something.
Yep, probably background noise. We can still hear you.
Oh, okay. And so one of the things I had to learn was that privilege is just sort of this ocean that we swim in, and that it's really hard to see it. I think when we learned about racism in school, we were taught about, like, unfair laws in the 50s or slavery, and so we were taught to look for things like that. We weren't taught to look for more subtle things. And so just two examples I wanted to give of privilege that it's easy to not be aware of. This year I became responsible for raising or parenting, semi-parenting a young African-American man, 18 years old, who's still in high school. And he came with my family to Christmas at my mother-in-law's, where I've gone every year for 30 years, in a kind of upscale neighborhood in San Jose where people do up the Christmas lights really, really nice. And we've been going there for forever, and my own children on many occasions have, decided to leave the party and go out and look at the Christmas lights, and it wasn't that big a deal. And this year, this young man said to me, "Oh, I'm going to go out and look at the lights." And I was like, "Oh, you're going to love it. It's so beautiful." And he walked out the door. And then 30 seconds later, I suddenly felt absolutely terrified, because I've seen everything that's happened on the news. And it was just that moment it was my first moment being a parent, not of white children, but of an African-American child. And I was suddenly like, oh my gosh, he's going to be out there walking alone, looking at these beautiful houses, and people are going to think he's casing the joint, and someone's going to call the cops, and, if he's belligerent, they'll kill him. And it just, sorry, I'm getting really emotional, but it was just so different to be a parent of a young black man than to hear news about other young black men and to hear other mothers describe it. And I've been to Christmas in that neighborhood 30 times. I've never had to stop and think, oh, aren't we lucky that we can just walk out our door and look at the lights and enjoy how beautiful it is. I never saw that was a privilege until I was suddenly terrified for this young man who indeed came back and described several cars slowing down and sort of giving him a look that said, "We're keeping our eye on you." There are other examples, but that took longer than I thought. Well, no, I will share the other one, because a friend of mine recently shared that as a teenager, the Oakland Police Department used to pick her up, throw her in the back seat, rape her, and put her back on the street. And I've known this woman 20 years, and she's never shared this story with me. And I had to really ask myself, why did she never share this story with me? It's horrible. And the reason is now the news is talking about OPD, Oakland Police Department, abusing young women. And so it's been sort of validated in the news. And I was like, did she feel like she had to wait 20 years for someone else to validate this story before she could speak her truth? That's horrible. Did she think if she shared this story with me that I would find it so astonishing and so horrible that I would question it? And of course, no rape survivor wants to go through that. So those were just some experiences that I had that made me just a little more aware of my privilege and how easy it is to not see it. And we're trained to not see it. So, there's other stuff I could say, but I think that's enough for now.
Rebecca, thank you so much. Really, really cannot thank you enough, and all those who have spoken up. Just thank you for sharing your experiences and just sharing that it's a process of becoming. There are some who are born aware of these issues, and for some others it's a process. Again, in terms of intersectionality, there are different aspects of our identity that we may come into recognizing are keeping us having a space where we can't see the experiences of others, and to speak about the process of being able to do that kind of deep listening and recognizing and seeing more of the world is really powerful. I know that I see that people are still hanging on. I don't know if our presenters have a couple of minutes to stay on and address a couple of questions that have come through. I see that there's a question and a comment. One question is, what do you see as different in person of color attitude coming from the Caribbean or small island states? I'm curious actually if people have responses in the chat box, or if presenters have responses who are from the Caribbean, are from small island states, have done work there, have perspectives on that. I know that there are very complicated sort of racial dynamics in the Caribbean, absolutely, and even among Caribbean-born folks in the U.S. and in other countries outside of the Caribbean. So I'll read that question, and then the comment around, I've seen that people with white privilege practice racism but don't accept any feedback and try to ignore by saying that if just was not intentional. That is something that we hear a lot. I know, I'll personalize it, that I hear a lot, and it's come up in this presentation, that oftentimes people feel like it's very important to explain that they're well-meaning, but that oftentimes individual intentions mean very little in the face of systemic oppression. I'm curious what other presenters have to say in response to those questions or comments. And if anyone's speaking right now, they're on mute.
Hi, this is JD. I feel like in recent years there has been more sort of dialogue and practices about emotional justice and about the sort of disproportionate sense that white people can have about needing to be heard or understood, and that includes needing to be, forgiven or apologies accepted or grappled with or engaged in dialogue with, and it's been important and challenging for me to sort of to recognize a new level of accountability in particularly social movement practices and also social practices of how to be in authentic relationships that also includes not feeling like I need to be understood or I need to be, that people, if I make a mistake, that people have to dialogue with me about it. It's enough that I could, if it's pointed out that I should just, have to figure out what I need to do. It can be, I can be told with more or less kindness, right? So that does affect things, and that also gets back to my social media point. But I think that's really important as sort of the white tears thing is real. That I think particularly sometimes one of the things of growing up under a female bodied person in a misogynist world is one thing you're supposed to get, particularly as a white woman, is we get to have our tears, and so it's like a refuge and a privilege. However, it's something that actually being expecting people to sort of respond to all my emotions can sometimes honestly be oppressive.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you, JD, for speaking to that comment. So now, in terms of the question around the sort of particular quality of racism in Caribbean states and in small states, I think that there was a kind of follow-up question about, in terms of the person who asked, what they see as the differences, what are the nuances on how race is structured or differently impactful in these different places. I don't know if that person's still on the call, wants to sort of put in some more details in the chat box, because again, sort of in the theme of this presentation, it's those who are really on the ground in places who are really who know the most about the nuances of systems of oppression there. It's folks who are from there, who are doing work there, who are most impacted by those nuances, who have information and who have the most nuanced information to share. There are definitely different, these dynamics change from place to place. I want to stop talking just in case anyone has any additional inputs. And again, I really hope that folks are reading the chat box. There are too many comments to read all of them, but it's just been a really, really phenomenal conversation and a set of really vital statements and comments that have been made in that chat box. So thank you so much to all who shared perspectives, who shared wisdom here. Any other comments or thoughts from presenters? As we are 7 minutes ahead of our past time, so to respect folks' time, I think it's time to sort of start to wrap up. But if anyone has any final comments in response to any of the questions or their own comments, please feel free to speak them. Come off mute.
In the absence of, if there aren't any more comments, I will be quiet if there are. But this is Krista Martel again from the Well Project, and I just want to reiterate deep appreciation for everyone who's participated and helped to make this webinar happen. It's kind of been something that we at the Well Project have been thinking about for a long time, and it's really it's exciting for us to be at this place to have this, and we're going to have to keep, figuring out other ways to continue the conversation, because one webinar and one fact sheet is definitely not enough. And so we encourage everyone to, access the web page once that's up and share the resources with others. Give us your feedback either through the website or email, or through the post-test or social media, whatever, on other ideas. I know there have been a lot of comments, and so we'll take all of those into consideration. And as I mentioned in the chat, we will be posting, it will take us a day or two to get everything together, but we'll put a web page together that will host the recording and the pre- and post-test, as well as the slides, the PDF of the slides, and the resources, and we'll try and put the chat on there too for other people to access and read that, and other additional resources. So again, thank you, and I know most people probably need to go, and our presenters are very busy, and again, we're privileged to have everyone on here. Thank you, Olivia, for doing such a fantastic job moderating. And with that, I will be quiet, and I will let everyone say goodbyes or have any other final comments, and then we'll end the meeting. So thank you.
Thank you so much again, Krista, and thank you so much to the Well Project for the phenomenal work you do. Thank you so much for bringing us all together here. Just wanted to say that.
This is Tonia. I wanted to say I think that our contact information is going to be on the slides, either visible here or on the Well Project website, as well as some other resources. And so I think we're all happy to be reached out to for further engagement and the resources that are available. Is that right, Olivia?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah, and that slide is up now. Thank you for the reminder so that folks can see your contact info as you wrap up. And thank you so much for being available to folks who may want to reach out with additional questions or anything like that.
Yes, agreed. And yeah, let's continue talking. I think it's just one step to start having these conversations, and not start, but to have this conversation. But I think it's important. I know a lot of people are feeling like, what can we do? But I think we need to talk. We need to find ways that each of us personally can make a difference. I mean, everyone can't do everything, but figure out what you're best at and how you can make a difference, and do your best to commit and show up. So, all right. Well, thank you. And thanks again, everyone, for participating and the great comments and the amazing presentations. Yes, we're signing off. Okay. Goodbye.
Take care,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. Have a great rest of your day. Keep breathing. Take care of yourselves and each other.